There is a servant in the Bible who did everything right, and Jesus still called him wicked. He did not steal a single coin from his master. He did not lose it, waste it, or run away. He gave back exactly what he was given, untouched, and that is the exact reason he was punished. Stay with me, because this story is not what you think it is. By the end of this video, something inside you is going to shift. You are about to see why playing it safe with God can be dangerous. It might be the most dangerous choice you ever make in your entire life. This is the parable of the talents. And there is one verse near the end that most churches quietly skip over. Once you hear it, something will click. You will understand why so many believers feel stuck, afraid, and small. Almost every modern reading of this story gets the main point completely wrong. What if the safest choice you could make is actually the riskiest choice of all? And what if the riskiest choice is the one that God actually celebrates? Today we are going to slow down and read it the way Jesus meant it. By the time we are finished here, you will never see safety the same way again. Jesus is in the last week of his life on earth. He has already entered Jerusalem, riding on a humble donkey. The cross is only days away from this moment, and in these final hours he is not relaxing, and he is not resting. Jesus knew exactly how little time he had left with these men. Out of everything he could have taught, in his final hours he chose this, a story about fear, fortune, faithfulness, and a master who returns. If Jesus considered this worth his last week, it deserves your full attention right now. He is sitting with his closest friends, teaching one final, urgent lesson. He is telling them what life looks like when the king is gone, not when the king arrives in glory, but when the king disappears for a while. This parable sits inside a set of 3 stories in Matthew chapter 25. The 10 virgins, the talents, and the sheep and the goats. All 3 stories ask the exact same hidden question. What do you do while you are waiting? What do you do when no one seems to be watching? What do you do with what you have been given in the silence? There is also a bigger picture sitting underneath this entire story. The man going on a journey is a picture of Jesus himself. He ascended, he is currently away, and Scripture promises he is coming back. Every single one of us is living in that exact gap right now, the time between his departure and his promised return. That is not just ancient history. That is the present moment you are living in. Which means this parable is not really about people from long ago. It is about you right now, in this exact season of waiting. Now here is the part almost nobody catches the first time through. There is one small detail buried deep inside this story. Once you see it, something changes. You can never read this parable the same way again. It changes who the real villain actually is. And it might even be sitting in your own life right now. We live in a culture that constantly tells us to protect ourselves first. Save everything, risk nothing. Keep your options open at all costs. Do not commit too early. Do not say too much. Do not stand out. And many of us have quietly applied that same mindset to our faith. We treat our relationship with God the way we treat a fragile object. Something to be kept safe, on a shelf, admired, but never actually used. This parable was told 2,000 years ago, but it is describing exactly that. In just a few minutes, you are going to hear a servant defend himself, and his defense is going to sound completely reasonable, maybe even familiar. You might catch yourself agreeing with him before you even realize it. That is the exact moment everything in this story changes. Keep that thought in mind as we keep going together. Let us start with one simple word, the word talent. In modern English, we hear that word and think of a skill, a gift, something natural, something you are simply good at. But that is not even close to what the word meant here. A talent was a unit of weight made of silver or gold, and 1 talent equaled about 6,000 denarii in that culture. 1 denarius was a full day of wages for an ordinary worker. Do the simple math with me for just a second. 1 talent worked out to roughly 20 years of income. Think about that in terms of your own paycheck today. 20 years of steady work, handed to you all at once. Notice one more detail before we move forward in the story. The text says the master gave to each according to their own ability. 5 talents went to the servant who could handle 5 talents. 2 talents went to the servant who could handle 2 talents. And 1 talent went to the servant who could handle 1 talent. This was not random, and it was not a setup designed to fail. Every single servant received exactly what they were equipped to carry. If you want a modern picture, think about it in dollars for a moment. If a single day of work today is worth around $200, then 1 talent alone would be worth well over $1 million. 5 talents would be worth more than $5 million, handed over at once. Now imagine waking up tomorrow and finding that amount sitting in your account, with no explanation, no instructions, just a note that says, "Make it grow." That is the position these 3 servants were actually standing in. Now look again at exactly what this master handed out. 5 talents to 1 servant. That is 100 years of wages. 2 talents to another servant. That is 40 years of wages. And 1 talent to the last servant, still 20 years of wages. This was not some small quiz with small consequences for failure. This man handed over a literal fortune, and then he walked away. No instructions, no manual, and no follow-up phone call. Just trust, an enormous amount of trust, placed into ordinary hands. The servant who received 5 talents did something remarkable immediately. He went at once, with no hesitation and no long planning meeting. No committee, no waiting for the perfect market conditions, no delay, no waiting until he felt 100% ready to begin. He simply took what he was given and started moving. He took the money and put it straight to work in the marketplace. And by the time the master returned, he had doubled the entire amount. The servant with 2 talents did the exact same thing. Same urgency, same risk, same outcome, just smaller starting numbers. He doubled what he was given as well, faithfully, quietly. Notice something important here before we move forward together. Neither servant knew the outcome before he ever started trading. Trading in that world meant real risk, and risk meant a real chance of total loss. They could have failed completely and lost everything entrusted to them. But they moved anyway, because that is exactly what faith looks like in action. Faith is not the absence of risk. Faith is moving forward, even when the outcome is not guaranteed at all. Think about how differently most of us operate today. We wait for certainty. We wait for confidence. We wait for permission. These 2 servants had none of those guarantees, and they moved anyway. But the 3rd servant did something completely different with his 1 talent. And what he did next is where this entire story turns dark. Before we get to that conversation, notice one small detail about time. The text says, the master returned only after a long time had passed, not a quick weekend trip, and not a short business errand. Years, most likely, years of silence and waiting, years where nothing seemed to change at all. Long enough for markets to shift and circumstances to change completely. Long enough for a buried talent to sit untouched while the world kept moving. Maybe that is exactly where you are tonight, in a long season of silence, praying for something to change and watching the calendar move instead, wondering if God even remembers what He placed in your hands years ago. He does. He has not forgotten, and the silence is not rejection. The silence is simply the space where the next move is yours to make. If you have been waiting on God for years, with nothing seeming to change, this is for you. The silence is not proof that nothing matters. The silence is the space where faithfulness is actually tested. When the master finally returns, He calls the first servant forward. "Master, you handed me 5 talents, and look, here are 5 more." And the master responds with words you need to hear very carefully. "Well done, good and faithful servant." Notice what he does not say in that moment. He does not say, "Well done, profitable servant." He does not say, "Well done, successful servant." He says, "faithful." That single word quietly changes the entire meaning of this story. This phrase appears nowhere else in Scripture quite like this. It is the kind of welcome reserved for someone fully trusted, fully known. Not an employee receiving a bonus, but a friend being welcomed home. The servant did not know in advance he would double the money. He only knew he had been trusted with something enormous and risky, and he chose to act anyway, even with the real risk of loss. The result happened to be profit, but the praise was for faithfulness. Then the second servant steps forward, holding much smaller numbers, and he hears the exact same words, word for word, no difference at all. "Well done, good and faithful servant." Same praise, smaller amount, same heart behind the action taken. Both servants, with completely different amounts, receive that exact same welcome home. Hold on to that detail, because it matters far more than you realize right now. We are going to come back to it before the end. Now here comes the servant most people remember for all the wrong reasons. "Master, I knew that you are a hard man," he says. "You harvest crops where you never even planted a single seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your money in the ground. Here it is, exactly the way you gave it to me, untouched." On the surface, this sounds like simple laziness, or maybe just fear. But here is something most people never learn about this culture. Burying money in the ancient world was not reckless behavior at all. In Jewish legal teaching of that time, burying money was an accepted form of protection. If you buried a deposit and someone stole it, you were not held liable. So this servant did not actually do something careless or foolish. He did something careful, cautious, and even legally defensible. He protected the money exactly the way the law of his day allowed. By every cultural standard around him, he made the responsible choice. Picture this servant walking out at night, shovel in hand, fortune wrapped tightly, digging carefully, placing the bag in the ground, covering it over completely, walking back home satisfied, believing he had done exactly the right thing. For years, probably, he slept soundly, confident in his careful decision. And then one day, the master came home. And Jesus calls that exact response wicked. Now pay very close attention, because this is the turn everything hinges on. Listen again, slowly, to how the third servant explains himself. "I knew that you are a hard man." That sentence is not describing what the servant actually did. It is describing what the servant believed about his master, deep down inside. A hard man, who harvests where he never planted anything at all, who demands results from places he never invested in, who expects profit without ever providing the means to produce it. If that is who you believe your master to be, burying the money makes perfect sense. Take no risks, make no moves, give back exactly what you were handed. Minimize your exposure and survive the encounter with nothing held against you. This is no longer a story about a lazy worker. This is a story about a distorted picture of God, hiding inside a man. The servant did not fail because he lacked ability or lacked opportunity. He failed because of who he believed was standing in front of him. Every single action in this story flows from one core belief, and that belief was wrong, completely wrong, from the very beginning. This is the moment most sermons quietly skip right past. But it might be the most important sentence in the entire parable. Maybe you grew up hearing that God is mostly disappointed in you. Maybe every sermon you remember focused more on rules than on relationship. Maybe you learned to see prayer as a performance, not a conversation. If that is the picture in your mind, of course you play it safe. Of course, you keep your head down, and your risks at zero. The third servant is not a villain from faraway history. He might be closer to your own story than you realize, because so many of us are doing the exact same thing today. We are not rebelling against God in some dramatic, obvious way. We are simply protecting ourselves from a version of God that does not exist. So how does the Master respond to a defense like that? You might expect him to soften, to show a little sympathy. But he does something else entirely, and it lands sharper than you expect. "You wicked, lazy servant," the Master says. "So you knew that I harvest where I never planted." Notice carefully what the Master does not say in this moment. He does not say, "That is not who I am." Instead, he says, "Then why did you do absolutely nothing at all? If you truly believed I demanded a return, you had other options available. You could have put my money with the bankers in town. At the very least, it would have earned interest while I was away." Even the laziest possible version of faithfulness was still available to him. Putting money in a bank required no skill, no risk, and no creativity. It simply required willingness, the one thing the servant did not have. This is what makes the rebuke so pointed and so uncomfortable. It was not that the bar was set too high for this servant. The bar was on the floor, and he still did not reach it. Sometimes the smallest step of faith is still a step we refuse to take. The Master is not letting fear off the hook here. He is saying, even on your own terms, your logic completely falls apart. Real fear of a demanding master should have produced more effort, not less. Not nothing, not silence, and not a hole in the ground. The servant chose the path of least resistance and quietly called it wisdom. But underneath that choice was something the Master never once asked for. Total inaction, carefully disguised as cautious obedience. Now here is where the parable reveals its deepest, most uncomfortable pattern. "Take the talent away from him," the Master says. "Give it instead to the one who already has 10. For whoever has will be given even more, and whoever does not have, even what little they hold will be taken away." At first, this sounds harsh, almost unfair, even cruel. But it is actually describing something true about how growth works everywhere. Think about a muscle that gets used consistently. Week after week, it grows stronger and gains the capacity to handle even more weight over time. Now, think about a muscle that never gets used at all. It does not stay the same. It weakens. It slowly wastes away. Think about compound interest, the way small amounts grow over years when invested. A small sum used consistently can become something enormous over time. That same principle is sitting at the center of this entire parable. What you do with a small amount today shapes what you are trusted with tomorrow. The servants who acted, who risked, who worked, they grew in capacity simply by using what they had. Using what they were given created more room for even more to be entrusted. The servant who buried his gift did not stay the same either. A living thing that goes unused does not remain neutral, ever. It shrinks, it weakens, and eventually it disappears completely. Think about a friendship that gets nurtured, week after week, with real effort. It grows deeper, and it can hold more honesty, more closeness, more trust. Now think about a friendship left untouched for years, with no calls, no visits. It does not stay the same either. It quietly fades away. The same law runs through your finances, your faith, and your relationships. What gets used and invested grows. What gets buried and ignored slowly disappears. This is not random punishment from an angry, distant God. This is simply how the kingdom of God operates, every single day. And then comes the final sentence, the one that should stop you cold. Throw that worthless servant outside, into the darkness. Outer darkness is not just a scary phrase used for dramatic effect. In this gospel, it means real distance. The furthest possible distance from the joy of the Master. Think about that for just a second longer. This servant never stole a single coin from anyone. He never rebelled openly, never walked away, never denied the master to his face. He simply did nothing, and Jesus treats that as deeply serious. Not neutral, not harmless, not understandable, serious. Because most of us are far more afraid of doing the wrong thing. Then we are afraid of doing nothing at all. And this story makes something clear. Fear itself can become the very thing that condemns us. That should make every single one of us pause right now. Now let us bring this story directly into your life, right now today. The third servant did not reject his master outright. He came back, he showed up, he returned exactly what he was given. He still called himself a servant the entire time, right to the end. This is the profile of a very specific, very common kind of faith. Not the person who walked away from God completely, but the person still sitting in church every Sunday, still praying, still present, yet quietly, privately, burying the exact thing God placed in their hands years ago. So what does burying actually look like in an ordinary American life? It looks like the gift you have never used, simply because you are scared. It looks like the calling you keep postponing until you feel ready enough. It looks like the business you dreamed about. 10 years later, still only on paper. It looks like the channel, or the book, the ministry, still sitting in your drafts folder. It looks like the conversation about faith you keep avoiding with someone you love. It looks like the apology you know you owe, still completely unspoken. Maybe it is that small group you felt called to lead. Years have passed, and it is still untouched. Maybe it is the neighbor you know needs an invitation to church, still unspoken. Maybe it is the savings sitting untouched, instead of being used for good. Maybe it is the voice you were given, the writing, the teaching, the singing. Maybe it is simply showing up, consistently at the place you already serve. Maybe it is finally saying yes to something small, the thing you have said no to for years. Something real, something useful, something that could serve other people, sitting completely idle. Not destroyed, not given away, just buried, safe, untouched, and quiet. It looks like years quietly passing by, whilst the same thing sits untouched in the ground. Not because you hated it, and not because you rejected it, but because you were afraid of what failure might say about you. Fear is what buried that talent, not laziness, not rebellion, simply fear. And that fear came from one single place, a wrong picture of God. So let us fix that picture, because the parable already hands it to us. Notice the order of events in this story, because it matters deeply. The master gave the gift first, before any work had been done. The servants did not earn the talents. They were simply handed to them. Everything that came after was a response to a gift already given. That order never changes. Grace always comes before the work, every single time. This master handed over a literal fortune before he gave a single instruction. No manual, no guaranteed outcome, and no safety net spelled out in advance. Just trust, enormous trust, placed into completely ordinary hands, and each servant received an amount carefully matched to what they could actually handle. The distribution was never designed for anyone to fail from the start. When the faithful servants returned, the master did not interrogate their every decision. He did not demand a breakdown of every single trade they had made. He simply looked at their faithfulness and said, "Well done." And then he said something even more remarkable than that. "Come and share in the happiness of your master." This is not a distant transaction, settled and forgotten. This is an invitation into ongoing joy, shared between master and servant. The reward for faithfulness was never simply more responsibility as a burden. It was access, closeness, and shared joy with the one who gave the gift. That is what was waiting for him. The entire time he was digging in the ground. That is not the language of a harsh, impossible to please God. That is the language of someone who genuinely delights in trust returned to him. The third servant never once saw this side of the master. He saw a trap where there was actually an open invitation waiting. He saw a courtroom where there was actually a celebration prepared for him. This is the picture so many people never get to see clearly. A God who hands you something valuable and then steps back, watching with hope. Not a God circling you with a checklist, waiting for one mistake. A God who already knows the risk and trusts you with it anyway. Look closely at the numbers one more time before we move toward the end. 5 talents, 2 talents, 1 talent, 3 completely different starting amounts. The first servant produced 10 total. The second produced 4 total. Different starting points, different final numbers, completely different outcomes on paper. Yet listen carefully to what each one was told by the master. Well done, good and faithful servant, word for word, both times, no difference. If the reward were based purely on output, the words would be different. The servant with 10 would receive more praise than the servant with 4. But he does not, because that is simply not the measure being used here. The measure is faithfulness, never the size of the final result. This detail alone destroys the comparison game before it even starts. The 5-talent servant was never compared to the 1-talent servant. Each one was simply asked, "What did you do with what you were given?" That is still the only question that matters. 2,000 years later, this matters more today than ever, in a world full of comparison. So many people scroll through the success of someone else and quietly feel smaller. They compare their own 2 talents to 10 that belongs to someone else every single day. And they walk away feeling less chosen, less gifted, less significant somehow. But what you were given is between you and God alone. What someone else was given is between them and God alone. Your faithfulness is never measured against the highlight reel of someone else. 2 talents, faithfully used, receives the exact same welcome as 10. That should feel like relief, not pressure, the moment it sinks in. You are not behind, you are not too small, you are not too late. You are simply being asked one thing. What will you do with what is in your hands? So here is the question I want to leave sitting with you tonight. Is there something real that God placed directly in your hands? Something you have never used, never tried, never even risked once, not because you rejected it, but because fear quietly took over instead. Afraid of doing it wrong, afraid of the cost, afraid of failing publicly. If that describes where you are right now, please listen closely to this. Look again at exactly what the Master praised in this entire story. Not perfection, not massive results, not flawless execution from start to finish. Faithfulness, simple faithfulness, with whatever was placed in your hands. And ask yourself this question honestly. What kind of master do you believe is watching you? A hard one, just waiting for you to fail. Or a generous one, waiting to share his joy with you. Because that one belief is quietly shaping every decision you make today. It is shaping what you start and what you keep putting off. Maybe you already tried once, and it did not go the way you hoped. Maybe you stepped out in faith before, and it ended in disappointment or even loss. If that is your story, look again at the 2 faithful servants. Nothing in this story says they were guaranteed success before they started. They risked real loss, and this time it worked. And they were praised regardless of the outcome. The praise was never tied to the outcome, only to the willingness to move. So even if your past attempt did not work out, the call on your life remains exactly the same. Get up, take what is still in your hands, and move again. Imagine for a moment that he returned today, this afternoon, right now. What would he find in your hands? Would he find something growing, something active, something being used, or would he find a shovel, a hole, and an explanation ready to go. That single image is worth sitting with for longer than a few seconds. This master trusted his servants with a fortune, 100 years of wages, and then he left. He did not demand a guaranteed outcome before he walked away. He only asked for trust, returned through action, however small that action might be, and when his servants acted in faith, even with real risk involved, he met them with joy. That is the master in this story, from beginning to end. Not a hard man, hunting for failure around every corner, but a generous one, hoping for faithfulness in ordinary hands. Remember, this parable does not stand alone in Matthew 25. The 10 virgins were ready, with enough oil when the bridegroom arrived. The sheep fed the hungry and clothed the cold without being asked twice, and the faithful servants put their gift to work, without waiting for permission. Every single story in this chapter is describing the same kind of life. A life lived ready, a life lived active, a life lived without fear. That is the kind of life Jesus is describing here for you today. In the end, none of us will be measured by how much we accumulated. We will be measured by what we did with what we were trusted with. That is a sobering thought, and also, strangely, a freeing one, because it means today, right now, is still full of opportunity. And one day, the question will not be, did you succeed? The question will simply be, were you faithful with what I gave you? Not were you impressive, not were you perfect. Simply were you faithful? Let that question replace the fear that has been running your life. Let it replace the silence that has surrounded whatever you have buried. Digging something back up rarely happens all at once. It usually starts with a single honest prayer, admitting where you have been. Lord, I have been afraid, and I have been hiding what you gave me. That single prayer is often the first shovel of dirt moved. From there, the next step becomes clearer than you expect. The ground is still open, and it is not too late to dig. If you made it this far, you were probably meant to hear this today. Do not let this be just another video you watched and then forgot. Let it be the moment the digging finally begins. If someone you know is sitting on a gift out of fear, send them this video right now. It might be the exact thing that finally gives them permission to start. And if this teaching opened your eyes today, hit subscribe for more truth like this every week.